Okay, so first off, thank you everybody for coming to the session, and to Gerald and the other organizers for the invitation to present. The papers so far have been super interesting. I've loved to see the variety and the kinds of topics people are working on internationally. And I'm bummed I can't make it to Singapore in person, but it's additional excuse to have another conference after this when all the travel restrictions have been lifted. So the paper I'm presenting today, it really speaks to the fundamental nature of the human condition. It answers one of the real burning philosophical questions of our time. Is a taco a sandwich? So this silly example comes from a real contract law case. There was a mall that leased space to a Panera restaurant, and the contract said the mall owner couldn't lease to any other store selling sandwiches. So they lease space to a Qdoba, which most of you probably never heard of these, but a Qdoba sells tacos. And the question is a taco a sandwich? And it turns out that there's a whole class of cases like this that essentially ask whether some X is a Y. So in my article, I discuss a few of these, like whether the Food and Drug Administration in the States has the authority to regulate any drug or device. And then the question is whether tobacco is a drug or a cigarette is a device. Incidentally, the Supreme Court said yes, and it gave the FDA the authority to regulate. So there are a lot of important regulatory, criminal, constitutional, contractual analyses that all turn on textual analysis of law. So I'm a statutory interpretation scholar. I'm going to focus on statutes, but these tools can really be used in any situation involving legal text. Now, the traditional way to study this has been through dictionaries and by consulting your own intuition. This has a lot of problems. So even the editors of dictionaries have argued they aren't designed to be used in this way. And because dictionaries are very comprehensive, judges can basically pick between dictionaries and between definitions to suit their favorite interpretation of the text. It's cherry picking. This is known as dictionary shopping. Over the past decades, folks have started to use a new method to empirically assess word usage called Corpus Linguistics. So they search through word databases like this one to see how language is used in real life. This has been controversial in America for a variety of reasons. In my paper, I flagged two potential problems with these methods. First, there are a lot of aspects of semantic meaning that you miss in these analyses because you're just looking at a specific word and its near neighbors. A second problem is that these methods are also subjective and very flexible, but their flexibility is hidden behind this kind of scientific veneer. And so while there are still a lot of subtle judgment calls that you use in these analyses, they're hidden. So I'm going to skip over some of these slides going into the details of why this is a problem and just jump to my solution. So my alternative to using this traditional style of corpus linguistics is what I call computational corpus linguistics. Now, many of you may be familiar with word embeddings and word vectors. The idea is that you generate a vector of just a series of numbers, and this represents a multidimensional word. So for any particular word, you'll have a corresponding vector, and there are all these dimensions of meaning that are captured. The way that you generate this is you have an objective function that you optimize based on a co-occurrence matrix. Happy to work through the technical details if anyone would like, but the long and short of it is that you come off with this multidimensional representation of semantic meaning, and it produces a variety of intuitive results. So for example, you take the vector for Paris, subtract the vector for France, add the vector for Japan, and it produces Tokyo, as you would expect. This is one of the technologies over the past 8 years or so that has been used to really revolutionize natural language processing. So tools like Google Translate, Siri, Alexa are all driven by word embeddings and by some more modern transformer models as well. But in this case, because I'm analyzing single words and there's no context involved, I use word embeddings rather than transformer models. So at this point, word embeddings are pretty well understood. They've been used in tens of thousands of academic papers. And so I use them here to understand the meanings of words in legal text. A note on the corpora that I use the English Wikipedia. which has 4 billion tokens or so, and what's known as the Corpus of Contemporary American English, which has about 1 billion tokens. So pretty large corpora, the kind of corpora you would usually use to train reliable word embeddings. I also bootstrap the embeddings I generate for these corpora, which I think is pretty uncommon from what I've seen of the literature so far, bootstrapping in such large corpora, probably because it takes a long runtime. I have some technical details of the word embeddings here, but I also plan to post the bootstrapped vectors online so that the analysis can be duplicated, and also so that if anyone wants to run their own analysis using these bootstrapped word embedding vector spaces, they can do so. I believe this is statistically kosher, but I'm not actually an econometrician, so if anyone has any foreseeable objections to these, please let me know. This is one of the first times I'm presenting the paper. I'm pretty sure this is okay though. Okay, so given the word embedding vector spaces that you generate, how do you actually solve the legal questions that I talked about? Well, the classic way to do this is to use what's known as cosine similarity. So a vector can be represented. Here you just imagine that you have a simple two-dimensional vector, but for a 100-dimensional vector, of course, it would be a 100-dimensional space. And you can just take the cosine distance between two vectors to assess how similar they are. So cat is quite similar to feline, driver is pretty similar to pilot, but cat is very different from pilot, and that's reflected in the cosine angle between them. So the similarity will be low for cat and pilot, high for cat and feline. Now the question is, you can generate cosine similarities, but they really have no independent significance. So I can say the cosine similarity is 0.3, but first of all, that's dependent upon the corpus that you train the word embeddings on. And so it's difficult to get an intuitive sense of what a high level of similarity is when you're comparing between corpora. And also it's just a number, right? Like I say, oh, 0.3, 0.5, you have no objective sense of what that should be. And so in this paper, I produce what I call the vehicle scale. It's a way to benchmark whether a cosine similarity estimate is high or low. And the rationale is that it comes from this famous vehicle hypothetical by H.O.A. Hart. Maybe you've heard of it. The idea is that there's a sign saying no vehicles allowed in the park. And you know a car isn't allowed in the park. You know sneakers are allowed in the park. But the question is the bicycle a vehicle? Is an airplane a vehicle? And so this has been the subject of a lot of legal analysis already, and we kind of have good intuitions about whether or not all of these various things are or are not vehicles. So here I generate a series of bootstrapped cosine similarity estimates. So the idea is we take two words, say car and vehicle, we calculate the cosine similarity between the two words, and then we do that bootstrapped over 50 iterations in my case, although I plan on increasing it for future versions of this paper. And you can see the probability density function corresponding to the bootstraps. So something like car vehicle, it's pretty high in cosine similarity. The distribution is pretty tight. For something like wheelchair and vehicle, it's lower, and also maybe it's a little, the variance is a little bit higher between the various bootstraps. So each row in this graph represents a probability density function from some word pair. And I use these particular vehicles because their meaning was stable across runs and across corpora. So the probability density functions is relatively tight and consistent between the two corpora. And this is a kind of intuitive spectrum. This is what you would hope to see. So crutches, not much like vehicle, skates, skis, wheelchair, cart, wagon, bicycle, airplane, automobile, truck, car. Now, I think it's pretty clear that a car is a vehicle. It's pretty clear that a truck is a vehicle, pretty clear that an automobile is a vehicle. There's actually case law in America on whether an airplane is a vehicle, and the court actually ruled no, although not necessarily on textual grounds. But when you get to this kind of range, maybe between bicycle and say wheelchair, I think probably the correct answer is that it's not clear whether it is or is not a vehicle. So this is what I call the zone of semantic indeterminacy. In this area, it's not a textual question alone whether X is a vehicle. and you would want to rely on other extrinsic evidence of textual meaning. So for example, legislative history if it's a statute, extrinsic evidence if it's a contract. I think there are equivalents in intellectual property as well. Within this range, there's no clear answer based on text alone, whereas above this range, you would say, okay, car is a vehicle, end of conversation. So one thing that the vehicle scale does is not just establish the level of semantic similarity, but also say whether the semantic similarity is sufficient to give a clear answer based on text alone. And it turns out that the answer is generally no. So this is the big reveal. I've taken a bunch of real world cases from American law, calculated their cosine similarity, again bootstrapped, and situated them on this vehicle scale. And you can see we have these real world cases: is an invention a discovery, is a judge a representative, is a fossil a mineral, is tobacco a drug, trading using, cigarette device, is snorkeling a sport, is a taco sandwich. They all fall within that zone of semantic indeterminacy between wheelchair and bicycle. So what this really means is that in these various real world cases, there is no clear semantic answer. The text alone shouldn't determine the case. You need to bring in that extrinsic evidence. Now, I'll caveat, this is my zone of indeterminacy. Like, I don't think that it's clear that a bicycle is a vehicle, but maybe someone else does. Maybe for another interpreter, there's no zone of indeterminacy, and bicycle clearly is not a vehicle, and the answer for all of these questions is no too. Maybe. It's a philosophical orientation, but I think for a normal American interpreter, at least, there would be considerable doubt about these items in the middle of the scale. And it's distinctive because in a lot of these cases, the judge actually said that the result was clear. So in a lot of these cases, the judge claimed that the text alone was decisive. Whereas I think a judge would be a little more reluctant to say something like, yes, the bicycle is obviously a vehicle. So a takeaway from this paper so far is that a lot of real world cases will fall within the zone of indeterminacy, contrary to what courts will often assert. However, if you think about it from a litigation dynamic perspective, this is totally unsurprising. There's something called the Priest-Klein hypothesis that suggests that only close cases ever go to trial because the decisive cases where there's a clear winner or loser are always settled before trial. And that supports this hypothesis. So that supports these findings, sorry. That maybe there are cases where we're closer to a car vehicle than a bicycle vehicle inquiry, but those were all settled before trial. And when you see actual judicial rulings, it's everything in this middle range. And you might also wonder whether we can impute a cutoff from the outcomes of actual cases. So for example, maybe everything below, say, this line was ruled dissimilar and above this line was ruled similar. And the answer is no. So the granular answer looking at these cases is that they're all over the place within this range, sometimes because the judge decided the case on other grounds. There is one other type of inquiry that you can do, which is not situating a word pair on the vehicle scale, but asking whether a word is more similar to X or Y. So for example, you probably can't read this, but this is asking whether a tomato is a vegetable or whether a tomato is a fruit. This is a real world Supreme Court case called Nix v. Hedden that had to do with whether tomatoes would be taxed based on the tariff rate for vegetables or for fruit. And the question is which one it's more similar to. So for all of these entries, because it's bootstraps, you can calculate empirical confidence intervals. So these lines represent 95 percentile confidence intervals, and you can see they're overlapping. So you probably can't see this either, but the cosine similarity estimates are very similar between the two of them, something like a 0.02 difference. And in addition, you fail to reject the null hypothesis that these estimates are different from each other. So both statistical significance and the magnitude of the cosine similarity suggests that it's not at all clear whether a tomato is a vegetable or a fruit. It's basically a tie between the two of them. Now, having said this, you might begin to wonder, okay, we've seen these results, but are we measuring what we purport to be measuring when we are comparing these two different words? And one way you can analyze whether or not you can be confident in these results, one way you can see what we're actually measuring is by using vector algebra to see the difference between the word vectors. So if you subtract cigarette and device, you get a kretek is an Indonesian cigarette. A hand-rolled refers to tobacco, hornworm, the tobacco hornworm cigars. So it seems like the difference is that cigarettes are devices composed of tobacco, essentially. Similarly, from fossil and mineral, you subtract them and you get these various, apparently these are like dinosaurs and things that are fossilized. So basically a fossil is like a mineral that's like a prehistoric animal or a dinosaur, which again is what you would expect. And in the paper I posted online, I do these for all of the real world cases. And you can see that they generally produce sensible results, which is a little bit reassuring. Okay, so this makes sense so far. We see all of these various real world cases that are somewhat indeterminate. We see that the vector subtraction produces what we would expect. But can we go a step further? So sometimes a particular query word, like tobacco, doesn't exactly capture the factual situation. So for example, there's a case called Chisholm v. Romer, where the question was whether a judge is a representative, like an elected congressperson. But the judge in question was specifically an elected judge, not an appointed judge. So an elected judge, in America, sometimes we appoint judges and sometimes we elect judges. An elected judge is surely more similar to an elected congressperson, right? They're both elected. But if you just analyze the simple word judge in the corpus, we don't know whether we're picking up the elected judge or the appointed judge. For a word embedding, they're all kind of smushed together. Now, one way to solve this would be to use transformers, but if you do that, you also have to specify the particular context that you're emphasizing. You can average across contexts, but this has its own problems. So assuming we want to stick with word embeddings, is there a solution? Well, it turns out there is. So let's go back to the taco and sandwich example. Imagine that I decide that the national origins of food shouldn't be a basis to declare something a sandwich or not a sandwich. So I want to analyze the similarity between an American taco and a sandwich. Now, originally tacos are from Mexico, but you can buy them at Taco Bell. To some extent, the vector for taco may reflect that they're widely eaten in America. So what I want to do is refine the vector to narrow in on the particular aspects of word meaning, like focusing on only elected judges or focusing only on American tacos. And I can do this in a few steps. First, we have to identify words that capture the direction of meaning that we're interested in. So here I want to identify American words and Mexican words. So like dollar and peso. Michael is the most common American first name. Miguel is the Mexican equivalent. Joe Biden, Obrador is the president of Mexico. American, Mexican, American, Mexico, etc. So I have all these words, and you can see this is what you would want from a well-trained embedding. I generated these from Wikipedia. You can see that there's this consistent geometric relationship between the American word and the Mexican word. From that, you can use principal component analysis to identify the direction that captures the distinction between America and Mexico, which is displayed on this axis here. As many of you probably know, principal component analysis produces a list of eigenvectors with associated eigenvalues, and then we sort those eigenvectors and eigenvalues in the order of the variance among these points that they capture. So empirical work suggests that the first eigenvector captures most of this variance, and that's the one I use, but in principle, you could use a series of eigenvectors for the refinement as well. So we captured the American-Mexican direction, and now we want to neutralize the vector for taco. What do? We take the original vector for taco, and we take the eigenvector we just generated from principal components analysis, and then we subtract this projection from the original vector. So in other words, this is also known as taking the vector rejection. This captures basically the current Americanness or Mexicanness of the vector for taco, and then you subtract that projection capturing the current Americanness or Mexicanness, and it gives you a neutral taco vector. And then if we want to convert it to an American taco vector, we just add back half the average vector difference between the American and Mexican words, and that gets you American taco. So that may seem plausible, but does it actually work? So as you'd expect it does. This process significantly increases the cosine similarity between taco and sandwich. Before it's about 0.318, after it's about 0.373. And if you look at the nearest neighbors, it also seems to bring the vector closer to American words. So again, you probably wouldn't be familiar with this. Well, maybe they have Domino's in Singapore, but Chipotle is like a Mexican themed restaurant. And Domino's is an American pizza chain. So this seems to, in some sense, Americanize the list of words. And although, as you'll notice, even before, pizza, Taco Bell, burger, like it's a pretty American list of words before, which suggests that you do want to identify the extent to which the vector already captures the American association, rather than just, for example, rebiasing by adding the American bias to the vector. Okay. The last thing I want to do in this paper is to try to identify differences in word meanings between standard corpora. So given two different word embedding dictionaries generated on different corpora, can we try and find a linear transformation that maps them onto a shared vector space as closely as possible? So I did this with my two corpora with vectors bootstrapped on the Wikipedia and on the corpus of contemporary American English. First, to validate that the alignment worked, I looked at the cosine similarity between the aligned embeddings for some common words whose meanings you would expect to be constant. So quantifier words, more, 1, 2, less, 3, etc. And if you look at the cosine similarity, it's pretty high. So after alignment, it does seem like we've successfully made it so that these words whose meanings we would expect to be similar are indeed extremely similar. So, but here's the real point of the alignment. I calculate cosine similarity for each word pair in each of the two corpora. So for example, I calculated cosine similarity for snorkeling and sport in the aligned Wikipedia corpus and in the aligned Coca corpus. Then I subtracted the cosine similarity estimate for the Wikipedia from the cosine similarity estimate for Coca. So you get the difference in that key variable, the cosine similarity estimate for a word pair. I do this 50 times, so it generates a bootstrapping probability distribution, which is in blue. Then we compare the blue distribution against a control distribution of quantifier word pairs, again bootstrapped. These are the words whose meanings you wouldn't expect to change between corpora. And therefore, you would expect this to be approximately 0. And if it's not 0, that's probably due to random variation. But you can see it is clustered around 0, and there's just variation based on syntactic differences in the corpora that we don't care about. Or perhaps the aligning isn't performing perfectly. So statistically, you can ask whether the blue distributions are different from the red distributions, and therefore, whether they're different from the red distributions, and therefore whether there is a statistically significant difference between the two corpora. The result is that yes, there are differences between the corpora that are statistically significant and large in magnitude. That suggests that corpus linguistics analysis, whether traditional or computational, needs to be done on more than one corpus at a time because the results can significantly differ between corpora. So another thing that you could do if you had more corpora, which I actually do and plan to do in the future, is to create an aggregated probability density function across several corpora. And preliminary results suggest that if you do this, that there's significant variation, but it actually is kind of like meta-normally distributed, and that the results still generally fall within what I call the zone of indeterminacy. Okay, so some limitations here. These computational methods have some advantages in that they're harder to method shop, they're reproducible, they address a broader range of semantic meanings, but there are some limitations. So there's still some potential for method shopping. And this methodology is extremely difficult for judges to understand. So I question whether this will ever be practically how judges decide cases, but perhaps it could be used by experts who are advising judges in court cases. And at this very early stage, at least, I think we can make general statements about trends in litigation. For example, that most cases tend to be semantically indeterminate, which is what I limit myself to in this paper. This also opens itself up to a variety of next steps. So I should evaluate more corpora. I can test hyperparameter stability. I can assess ordinary meanings versus legal meanings. I can test changes in word meaning over time. I can apply it to historical cases. There's a lot of stuff that you could do here. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to any comments or questions. Oh, sorry, I missed your question, Jason. Let me stop share.
Let's take Jason's question first, and then I'll go to, yeah. Jason, do you have a question in the chat, I suppose? Oh, it's been answered. Okay, sorry. I think we have a question from the live audience.
Yeah, hi. Yes, I don't know. I'm not visible. So I'm Corinna. Thanks for the talk. I have a question regarding your methodology, especially the vehicle scale that you're introducing. So I was wondering whether you also experimented with basically giving each word pair kind of its own scale, in the sense that you could imagine that you have a word pair and that's kind of your problem, and you know some positive and some negative examples, or even you could generate some kind of fuzzy labeling just from the data. So basically you project all of this and you have a point cloud. Some are positive, some are negative examples, and you could measure the distances on that particular scale, in the sense that you would want to classify the point in question based on the distance to what you know positive examples are, and whether that's significantly different from the negative examples, such that you could make this kind of the determination of whether it's a vehicle or whatnot, more data driven in a sense.
That's really interesting. I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting, though. Sorry, would you mind explaining a little bit further, especially about, say, like the point cloud?
Yeah, so, well, basically what I'm saying is, you know where in vector space, say, just the vehicle is, and you know where your car is. And then you know what the other positive examples are. And it might be that in a different scenario, like you have the taco and the sandwich, the difference between other things that are sandwiches, or the distance between other things that are sandwiches and the taco is inherently larger than what you would have on the vehicle scale, in the sense that each of the problems might have its own distance scale in the embedding space, and you would want to customize that and take that into account. I guess
I see what you mean. Yeah.
And
so you could.
Okay, go ahead first.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So basically, you could, for each what I call reference word in the paper. So like for vehicle or for like sandwich, you could create like a probability density function of cosine similarities compared to sandwich. So like take like phone sandwich, pen sandwich, like every random word, and then it could be customized. That's an interesting idea. I think I've seen people do stuff like that, and the probability density functions for words are sufficiently similar that I'm not sure it would be so different, but it's definitely worth doing. It's a good idea. Thank you.
So, I mean, just to elaborate on that, because you mentioned as one of the drawbacks that these might be like hard to explain to practitioners.
Yeah.
So if you're using that case intrinsic scale, and let's forget about the negative examples, but the practitioner will know what the positive examples are, or some of them. What you could also try to do is actually find counterfactuals, in the sense that if I look at the scale and I also add this positive example, or I also think that an airplane is a vehicle, then I'd give you a different answer on that particular question. So in the sense that it would allow you to locate your particular problem semantically in that space that the practitioner is already familiar with, and also tell them in terms of robustness, if your set of positive examples that you're giving me to compare against is this, I'd say it's still a vehicle, and otherwise it might not be.
Yeah, I like that. So, I mean, the genesis in this project was initially I was thinking maybe I would have like a tool where people get a series of word pairs and I ask them, is this the same or is it not the same? So like, do you think airplane is the same as vehicle? Do you think sandwich is the same as taco, whatever? And then impute what their personal scale would be. And then from that, like after establishing what your scale is, then we have an extra one, like an extra word pair, like is snorkeling a sport? And then I tell you what you should think to be consistent with your other preferences. It sounds like what you're suggesting is perhaps kind of along those lines.
It's in that direction, yes. And it's, I guess my primary concern is that if you want to judge all of the word pair problems on a single scale, that might be hard because the intrinsic distances between things that are the same or not might be different. It's like not normalized in a way.
Yeah, that's.
So you could also try to kind of normalize the distances to the vehicle scale, and that would eliminate that problem. But I wouldn't know out of the box how to do that. So I'd rather use the intrinsic scale because it's also more semantically meaningful.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I got to think about it more. Yeah, and I maybe I have to go back and read the literature, but I didn't think that there would be a problem with comparing between unrelated word pairs, but maybe I'm wrong. It's a good point. Interesting.
Let me check any more questions. If you don't mind, I might drop something in. So I wonder if I might miss something, but currently I think the idea is to have distance from the word vehicle, and I think the assumption might be that there is this monotonically decreasing scale of vehicleness, right? Based on the cosine distance. But I'm not sure whether it's safe to make that kind of assumption that it's so beautifully decreasing. Might there be examples of things that we would definitely consider to be vehicles, but they are just distance for some reason just is very, very low. And to what extent might that actually pose a challenge to the methodology?
It would, but I think the vehicles that I tested were kind of like an intuitive order. So, and I'm not sure I heard the question fully, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought maybe you were saying that it would be a problem if the vehicles didn't fall on the scale as you expected, but one of the findings in the paper, I guess, is that the vehicles fall basically in exactly the order that I would have expected, at least. Like a car is more vehicle-like than like a truck, or like skis are less vehicle-like than a bicycle, things like that. Did I misunderstand?
No. I think that was exactly the question I wanted to ask, because I think the larger concern is whether it's safe to assume that there is this monotonically decreasing scale of vehicleness.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that's perfectly correlated, or at least correlated substantially with the cosine distance from the word vehicle. Because I might imagine there might be words like, I don't know, Chrysler or Mercedes that are maybe a little bit far off, and we might consider them to be clear instances of vehicles. Maybe they're not, but they may fall very low on the cosine similarity scale because of just the way they are used in the corpuses we train them on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't tested that. I actually don't know. I think I just need to test that. That's really interesting. I think you're right, and that there's a kind of like question about almost like linguistic taxonomy there, where if you have like a very specialized word. So I actually do kind of discuss this in the paper, that like the word ambulance is less similar to vehicle than the word truck. Even though like in some senses, you might think that an ambulance is just like a truck at a hospital. So is that the right result? I kind of like hint at that I think it is the right result. And the reason is that if you think of words in a contract or a statute as giving notice, and the more specialized the case, the less likely that that appropriate notice has been given. So if I say no vehicles in a park, it does in a sense seem appropriate to classify trucks as vehicles, but maybe not necessarily classify ambulances as vehicles. But then if you have something like a Chrysler, like that doesn't seem to fit into that rubric. So that's another good point to think about.